Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us each week to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Basically, today was quite an eventful day. It was quite a historic day, if one thinks about it. The second time ever in Israel's history that its president, who is the head of state, was invited to address both houses of Congress. One would think that such an event would be broadcast. It was broadcast live on all the major channels. But the most remarkable thing is it did not lead the main news at 8 o'clock. The main news at 8 o'clock is the most watched program in Israel. And remarkably, the speech by President Herzog to the joint houses did not lead the news. And that really says a lot about where we are in Israel today. What did lead is another round of judicial protests and the latest events and initiatives surrounding that, which I'm going to speak about after I actually am going to flip that, and I'm going to talk a little bit more, or at least at first, about the address to Congress by President Herzog and in general the visit. First of all, I'll say what it isn't. The visit of President Isaac Herzog was not about Netanyahu, as many speculated and commentators in Israel. This invite, if we remember, was actually made in January, really, really early in the life of this current government, before really too much had got going, certainly before any type of judicial reform had been put on the table. So it wasn't an invite to thumb the nose at Netanyahu. It was an invitation by the majority and minority leaders to Israel on what was an occasion to be celebrated. What is an occasion to be celebrated? Israel's 75th anniversary since its establishment. And that really was the purpose, really just to show the friendship between the two countries, where the relationship is, and everything like that. That was the original intention. Because of the timing, basically, there was a lot of drama, a lot of diplomatic theatre that was inserted into the event as a result of the timing. First of all, we had quite a week of sort of back and forth between DC and Jerusalem. We had a lot of contradictory messages. On Monday, we had, just before President Herzog took off for DC, because he was there yesterday having meetings with the Secretary of State, with President Biden and others. Before he even set off, there was a conversation which hadn't taken place in many months between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And again, depending on your readout, depending on where you're sitting, there are two relatively different versions of what happened during that conversation. Both sides will say it was a relatively good conversation, but exactly what was contained is a little bit contradictory. The Americans have certainly put out that there was a strong emphasis by President Biden on Netanyahu to, if not stop the judicial reform, at least hold off and try and find consensus. This is not a new message. This is a message that has come out not just from the White House, but from a lot of proxies, whether in the media or through Ambassador Nides, who is leaving his post. And the idea of putting the brakes on, as Ambassador Nides, the phrase that he'd used before, again, is not a new one, but the Americans were putting an emphasis that was very much part of the conversation, whereas the readout from this end, especially through National Security Advisor Tzachi Hanegbi, said that was a very peripheral part of the conversation and put more of an emphasis on talks to do with Iran, talks to do with the U.S. Israel relationship. But the fact remains that it was an important step because it took a certain amount of the edge of President Herzog's trip. It wouldn't surprise me at all if this was a demand or at least a request by President Herzog. So it wouldn't be overshadowing his historic visit to the US. The fact that it happened was important. And also what came out around the same time is the fact that President Biden, again, contradictory messages, said that he would meet with Netanyahu later in the year. Now, initially, the Israelis immediately came out and put out that this was an official invite to the White House around September, it was suggested. But again, the Americans seemed to put a bit of a curveball in there and dampen the enthusiasm and said, it's a meeting. We haven't worked out exactly when, and interestingly, where, which means obviously President Biden isn't going to meet Prime Minister Netanyahu in Miami or Chicago or somewhere else, which means the event, to the Americans at least, could, in theory, take place abroad. This is not unprecedented. Leaders do meet at various events, conferences, forums. Could be that President Biden is visiting somewhere around the same time as Netanyahu, and they arrange a time to meet. Again, not unprecedented, but certainly unprecedented for the first meeting between a prime minister and a president during the prime minister's tenure. Obviously, this is not the first meeting between Biden and Netanyahu, but this has been, to my mind at least, certainly in recent history, the longest amount of time that a prime minister has not met with a president, a US president, at the beginning of their tenure. So that did take a little bit of the edge off. Then to put a little bit more of the edge on, around the same time or just after, President Herzog was meeting with President Biden. President Biden also sat for an hour, apparently after calling him in, at the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman. Now, we've spoken about him in the past, and he's very much, in Israel, we're used to him being a bit of a mouthpiece for the White House to send messages. And in fact, we saw one a couple of weeks ago. And the messaging isn't that different, that if this Israeli government continues with the pace of judicial reform without some level of consensus, that could impact the U.S. Israel relationship. Whereas before, Thomas Friedman didn't necessarily get any direct quotes or didn't state openly that this was a direct message from the White House. The White House quite openly admitted that this meeting had taken place and did give at least two open quotes to Thomas Friedman, obviously not the more controversial ones, but Thomas Friedman was obviously trying to be used, and this happening just on the eve of President Herzog's historic address certainly muddled the water again. It could have been a couple of days later, but it's clear in Thomas Friedman's words, and he did address Channel 11 in Israel earlier, that President Biden did want to send a message to every single citizen in Israel, and that's what the article was supposed to be about. Obviously, Thomas Friedman said that the messages in this article, which he wrote, are similar to the messages that President Biden himself gave to Netanyahu. The Netanyahu administration, that said, people around him said that actually is not true. These are not the messages he gave. Yes, judicial reform did come up. He wanted to hear what was going on, but according to Prime Minister Netanyahu, they are continuing with the reasonableness bill, and they're going to try and finish it by the end of the week. What did also come out of it, which went a little bit under the radar, is the fact that the Israeli government agreed not to build any more settlements. That caused a little bit of a furore within the cabinet, as one can imagine, because there are more extreme right-wing elements. But the people around Netanyahu will claim, with some justification, that there's been already up so far in 2023 more settlements built and more going through the authorization than in any other year. And in fact, this was backed up by the Peace Now organization, which is anti-settlement. They said since 2012, they haven't seen as many authorizations for settlement housing. So you can argue both sides. The fact that they pushed everything through early means that they can sort of sit back and say they did quite a lot. But on the other hand, it does seem that there's some sort of unofficial freeze until the end of the year, probably almost certainly at the behest of the Biden administration. The fact that this was all taking place with the backdrop of the judicial protest is very, very important. There was another day of mass protests on Tuesday, which shut down again lots of roads. There were lots of arrests. There were lots of confrontations, especially with the police, etc. And it seems that the judicial protests are really trying to ramp things up ahead of the reasonableness bill. One should not forget that so far, even though there has been progress on some parts of judicial reform legislation, this is the only one that there is an intention to pass in this particular Knesset sitting, which finishes in just over a week. And then we have quite a long break, including the summer and then including the Jewish holidays until the Knesset recess is over and meets again. So this is quite an important element for Netanyahu's coalition allies. I would say probably for him, it's probably less important for his coalition allies. And the question is exactly what's going to happen to the reasonableness bill, because it passed to its first reading. And as we know, after the first reading in the plenum, it goes back to committee. And as we know, the head of the chair of the judicial committee in the Knesset, Simcha Rotman, one of the leaders, architects, some would call him, of the judicial reform, the whole reform as it is. There was, I think, 27 amendments suggested by the opposition, clearly a filibuster to try and delay everything. Again, they're dealing with Simcha Rotman, who is in a hurry, is in a rush to try and get things moving as quickly as possible. He has got on record, as have others, more hawkish in the government, that they expect the reasonableness law to be unchanged from its first reading. And as I was in the Knesset earlier in the week, there is a lot of talk on exactly whether this is a demonstration of Netanyahu's control of the situation. What do I mean by that? If the reasonableness law does go through absolutely unchanged in any way, shape, or form, this is probably not what Netanyahu wants or even needs at this point. It probably means that Rotman and Levin, Justice Minister Levin, and others have got their way. But if there are certain changes, or if the bill doesn't go up at all, that means that Netanyahu is still very, very much in control. Interestingly enough, after everything that happened today, leader of the National Unity Party, Benny Gantz, decided to do his own primetime speech, where he called on Prime Minister Netanyahu to immediately meet at the president's house, even though the president isn't there, to try and discuss some consensus over judicial reform. Interestingly, he did say that he would be prepared, at least his party, would be prepared to vote in favor of the reasonableness law if Netanyahu would make a public commitment with the president that all the other elements of judicial reform would be passed only through consensus, which also gives a little bit of legitimacy, which I've been saying for the last couple of weeks, that the reasonableness bill is not the most important for the opposition. It's probably the area of most consensus, let's say, and that was understood when negotiations did take place at the president's office. What is, though, more problematic for Netanyahu at this point is that while Benny Gantz may be interested to come to the table, may be interested to even find a way forward for the reasonableness bill, the leaders of the protest movement are not. As I said, they've taken the protests up a level, but most worryingly for the government at this point is what's happening with the decision by some IDF officers and recruits and people who do their annual service that they will no longer show up. In previous weeks, we've seen all these petitions, but petitions don't mean much. And we always know that a lot of the petitions that are signed are by people who've already retired from the army or barely do any sort of service at this point. So it's more of a show, it's more symbolism. What is starting to happen is it is starting to arguably affect, if not the ability of Israel's army, certainly the morale, and it is affecting the upper brass in the IDF. The IDF chief of staff did come to the Knesset this week, did present to the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee and said, at this point in time, this is a very crucial part, at this point in time, the refusal to serve does not affect Israel's defensive ability. But as I just said, the most important part is at this time, which means that they can foresee a moment in the near future where it really could affect. And don't forget, there's a lot of refusal, at least these petitions, and people have said that they're not turning up in the senior echelons of the Air Force. And the Air Force, obviously, is very important. They're doing sorties over Syria regularly. And obviously, the Israeli Air Force would be at the forefront of any potential threat on Iran's nuclear weapons program. So that's really of great importance in the background of everything that's going on in DC. And with the back and forth between Biden and Netanyahu, the judicial protests have certainly managed to hold the headlines, have managed to grab the attention, and there is a lot of concern in the government, especially surrounding this upping of the ante of the refusal to serve. One final, maybe even related thing that came out this week was the invitation by the King of Morocco to Prime Minister Netanyahu to come and meet. That's also significant, especially for Netanyahu, who hasn't had that many invites to by world leaders, especially, as I said before, up until this week from President Biden. But the fact that the King of Morocco invited him, there wasn't a specific date, although there were suggestions again around September, something like that. But again, no coincidence, because only 2 days previous to that, Israel did recognize Morocco's rights to the Western Sahara. I'm not going to go into the whole details exactly what that means with the Western Sahara, but it's obviously very well coordinated, and that was a huge step that the Israeli government took, and it was reciprocated, obviously, in an organized fashion by the Moroccans. So I'm happy to answer any questions on these or any other issues.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question is from Ala Khan, asking or stating, I was shocked to see in the New York Times a photo of Israeli protesters near the U.S. Embassy branch in Tel Aviv with a Biden Save Us sign, despite the well-demonstrated current tepid attitude towards Israel of this White House. Could you please comment on that?
Well, it's clearly having an effect, as I said, through the comments that were made by senior American officials and by President Biden himself. He was on CNN not too long ago and described this government as the most extreme in its history and talked about his unease with certain acts and certain members of this government. And now you see that the judicial protests are having an effect. The fact is that President Biden is very aware of them, and he is sending very clear, sometimes less clear, sometimes more opaque, sometimes less messages, not just to the Israeli government, but in Thomas Friedman's words, to every single Israeli. So that tactic of protesting outside the U.S. embassy is, I mean, it's not just that's having an effect, but clearly the protesters do believe that they have an open ear in the White House, and the Biden administration is proving that it certainly does. So that's what makes sense. And again, I have to stress that there are differences, certainly between the Biden administration and Prime Minister Netanyahu's government. But at the end of the day, President Biden does have a long history of support for Israel. And the fact that he's paying this much attention, I don't believe, looking at Biden's history, that he's doing this, using this as a weapon to sort of beat Israel. I do believe that he is genuinely concerned. Now, obviously, we can have that debate whether it's right or not, but I think it'd be unfair to characterize President Biden himself. There may be other people in the administration less so, but it'd be certainly unfair to characterize President Biden as someone who's not sympathetic towards Israel. In fact, Thomas Friedman came out with this relatively remarkable statement that said that Netanyahu should be extremely attentive because this could be the last pro-Israel Democratic president. I think that may be a slight exaggeration, but that again is, they're trying to panic the Israeli public. They're trying to panic the Israeli government. They're trying to panic Netanyahu, trying to send these contradictory messages back and forth. But clearly, the White House and the American administration is very much seeing the protests, whether they're at the U.S. Embassy or elsewhere.
Thank you so much. Barak Korkmaz asks, do you think Netanyahu's halt on settlements could convince the Biden administration in the context of the upcoming 2024 elections?
Convince them, I'm not sure I understand the question. Convince who of what? It's clear that it's something that the Biden administration asked for. It's a step which Netanyahu, I wouldn't say is comfortable in giving, but it's clear that with the amount of settlement authorizations he's already given this year, it's obviously a step which he feels that he can give without too much problem to his allies in the government. Perhaps that's why he may, I said earlier, if the law does pass as is, maybe it shows that Netanyahu has less control. Maybe Netanyahu, this is the quid pro quo with his allies in the government, that he has agreed, at least sort of unofficially, obviously there's no official freeze, but he has agreed unofficially, at least to the Biden administration, that there will be no new authorizations. But he's going to, maybe this is a message that he's going to have to pass the reasonableness test, because he has to give his coalition allies something after that sort of unofficial freeze. So that could be part of the strategy.
Thank you. Kenneth and Elaine Leiter asks, could you please comment on the U.S. House resolution supporting strong U.S. Israel relationship and on the 9 Democrat members who voted against it?
Yeah, I should say in the whole sort of diary of events that is a relatively important moment that was missed. I mean, it was missed because it wasn't really that controversial at the end. It was an attempt, that this is the way I read it, or this is the way it's being displayed. Again, I'm not an expert on American politics, but of the Republicans trying to embarrass the Democrats. But clearly, in the end, everybody apart from 10 congressmen and women voted for this. Over 400, I can't remember the exact numbers, voted in favor. But of course, as usual, people focus on who voted against. There's no surprises. And really, we should look at the numbers. Whereas 9 voted against and 1 voted present without voting for or against, whereas over 400 voted for it, including people you would think are quite critical of Israel. It really received overwhelming support on both sides of the aisle. And I think that's what we should focus on. We always like to point out the very small handful of, people who we all know who they are. It's the usual suspects who are going to vote against it. But I think we should really focus less on that, because we're playing into their hands. Because why should 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of their votes really take all the headlines where 400 voted for? So it was an important resolution. It was a sense of Congress, which means it doesn't have that much meaning. Well, there was a certain amount of symbolism, as I said, and the fact that, everyone really got on board. And when I say everyone, what is the percentage? Like 90-something%. So almost wall-to-wall support of Israel at an important moment, I think it also just shows that despite the headlines that people like Tlaib and the rest of the squad get over their anti-Israel comments, the vast majority of the democratically represented members of Congress are pro-Israel and understand the strength of the U.S. Israel relationship.
That's a very fair point. So an anonymous attendee asks, when you mention approvals for settlements, does this represent actual homes built, or is it just legal approvals for some time in the near or far future? And what good is approval without action?
Right. To build anywhere takes certain levels of approval, registration, etc., etc. It's even more difficult over the Green Line in Judea and Samaria because of various legal issues. So usually there are certain layers of approval. Usually there's the first sort of, we're going to build 1,000 homes here, 100 homes there, whatever it is, which has happened already this year. Nothing has actually been built since the beginning of the year. It can take years, sometimes 1-2 years from the first approval to actual bricks and mortar. So probably we will not hear any more even first stage approvals towards the end of the year. We won't hear probably any announcement for more settlement building over the Green Line. I think rather than actual bricks and mortar, because there's always building going on, because who knows when it was approved. You could have something approved 10 years ago, not have the money or the ability or the will to build. That doesn't mean that it wasn't approved recently or something like that. So I think we're talking really at this point about the most early stages of approval.
Thank you. Stephen Orlow asks, is there any segment of the Israeli public that has a deep resentment at being treated in such a paternalistic fashion by the administration, constantly interfering in Israel's internal affairs? Or is this just, two countries working together?
Most polls that I've seen understand that the US, Israelis do understand that the US is Israel's closest ally. It's a member of the Security Council. It uses its veto regularly. It supports Israel International Forum, which is absolutely vital. It does give defense aid to Israel, but it's not a one-way relationship. Israelis understand that. As President Biden said in his meeting with President Herzog, and this doesn't get heard enough, that Israel is very important to the US as well. And as President Biden said, if there wasn't an Israel, we would have to create one. In other words, we serve a very, very important purpose for U.S. interests in the region. So it's not just a one-way relationship. Obviously, the U.S. is the most powerful nation on earth. It is the superpower in the world, and Israel is very thankful for its friendship. There is a segment of the Israeli population, most on the sort of the right or to the far right, which says, if America can't get on board with what we believe, we're talking about how these people would paraphrase it, then we can do without their aid, we can do without their friendship. But most Israelis will not really give it too much thought. As I said, what's going on internally for them is far more important than what's going on externally in diplomatic matters, which they don't understand or they're not as interested in. But yeah, there is a segment of the population, as I said, on the right, on the far right, probably supporters of Ben Gvir, supporters of Smotrich, certainly the ultra-Orthodox parties or members will not necessarily care too much about what America does or doesn't do or says or doesn't say. But it's clear that, someone like Prime Minister Netanyahu has to at least listen to what the president of the US says, and someone who understands American mentality, understands American politics. Netanyahu, there's probably no one greater in this country who understands the US, having lived there and studied there, as he did. So he's very, very attentive to what the US has to say, but he also understands this sort of back and forth and these whispers behind closed doors and these media releases and unsourced statements and all this sort of thing. So he understands that, and he understands that he has to tread a very fine line, what's good, what he believes is good for the country, and taking into account what the closest ally around the world says, suggests, or recommends.
Thank you. And our final question of the day, Charles Sullengood asks, how much are the demonstrations about judicial reform and how much could be attributed to religious and cultural conflict, if any?
It's a good question. I mean, it's. I would say, from my vantage point, not that I've taken part in the demonstrations myself, but I would say it is about the judicial reform. Do they understand does the average person understand all the elements of judicial reform? I'm sure if I went to the demonstration and I asked the average person demonstrating, not the leaders of the movement, but the average person demonstrating, could you explain to me what the reasonableness bill is about? Where does the reasonableness principle come from? And when was it introduced into the Israeli judicial system? I would probably get blank stares. But they do understand that something is happening that they're not happy about. Is it about the fact that they lost the elections? Not to say, by the way, there are some right-wingers, obviously in a minority, who are part of the demonstrations. There is a movement to try and bring in right-wingers who are unhappy with the pace and the extent and the breadth of judicial reform. And there is an element there. But the majority are on the left, the center, who are unhappy about the judicial reform. Are they unhappy about other things as well? What the judicial reform could affect? Could it affect the ultra-Orthodox enlistment? They believe so. Do they believe that it could reintroduce Aryeh Deri into the cabinet? Yes, and they would certainly be against that. Do they believe that it would give the government unbridled power, as they would say, move us towards authoritarianism? They mostly do believe that, because that's what are the rallying slogans of the protest movement. Are they mostly secular? Yes. Are they mostly left of center? Yes. But that's not necessarily a dividing line or a division. But it certainly is about ideology. It certainly is where you sit on the political map, where you sit on the religious map. But I wouldn't say that these issues are necessarily at the foreground. You do see men with kippot at the demonstrations, and you see secular people against the demonstrations. I think on Sunday there's a call for an anti-protest demonstration or for the judicial reform. They won't get the numbers, quite simply because also when you're rallying against something, it's much easier to get the numbers than when you're rallying for something. But we'll see what the numbers are. But I would say that it is mostly about judicial reform. That's the rallying call. If it was about other issues, when they've tried to do a rally, for example, against the ultra-Orthodox community and the lack of enlistment and contributing equally to the burden and taxes, etc., it was a far smaller rally. So I would say it is mostly about the judicial reform for the rank and file protester. But the exact intentions, I can't speak to.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Sirwan Kajo discussing U.S. forces in Syria. What role do they play? Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.